I really like the whole of it is great. His installation team, really nice
So I just want to welcome you to the final plenary of today. I hope you've had a really informative day, lots of discussions, lots of new information around anthropology and global shifts and all its permutations. I'm the chair for this evening's session. My name is Julie Botticello. I'm an anthropologist. I teach in public health at UEL, and I'm one of the organisers, as Adam mentioned this morning, of this event. And I just, a couple of things of housekeeping, so to speak. So we're live streaming, okay? And it's going out as we speak, and it will be uploaded to YouTube later for perpetuity. So when we have any question time in about 20-25 minutes or so, is there anyone here who objects to being recorded? We all object, right? Any specific objections? If you do, we can stop the live stream. Even if you don't, we'll just keep it rolling. So is that all right? Okay, silence gives consent. So we have 4 speakers with us today. So we've got Emma Tarlow, who's a professor at Goldsmiths. She looks at India and Britain on dress and identity politics and hair and the entanglements of hair. We have Gabriel Detrayan from Goldsmiths. He's a lecturer, and he looks at sort of diaspora, transnationalism, and sort of self-representation, particularly among hip-hop groups in South India.
In Delhi.
In Delhi, sorry, yes. And we've got Edward Simpson from SOAS, who's a professor, and he's looking at sort of archival anthropological work in India in the 1950s, and then doing research contemporarily around that. He's also looked at a little biography of an earthquake and how disasters and catastrophes create social change, in terms of looking at roads. And then we also have Raphael Schachter, who's based here at UCL. He's a postdoctoral fellow. He does graffiti and street art, and has an upcoming exhibition in 2 years' time, which he's working collaboratively together. Okay, so we're going to start with ladies first, women first, and we're going to begin with Emma. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a huge pleasure at the end of the term that anybody who's in the teaching side of things will have been faced with the huge piles of exam papers and scripts. So it's been a great opportunity to dive away from the exam papers and into people's live research. Now, the theme, global shifts, inevitably gets one thinking about the kind of shifty nature of the word, to shift. So we've got the sort of shift as in causing movement, which might be a large movement or a small movement, a seismic movement. We've got shift as sort of changing gears, perhaps going into reverse, this kind of spatio-temporal kind of movements. But then we've also got this idea of things being shifty, kind of invasive and difficult to pin down, and sort of somewhere in between the uncertain and the unreliable, maybe, this kind of shiftiness of things. And I think as anthropologists, we're kind of inevitably both wrestling with and caught up in what are quite elusive shifts of politics, of ideas, of economy, of memory, of matter, of images, and so forth. And at the same time, trying to comprehend how people navigate and also further transform these changing conditions. So I think, the metaphor of shifting sands is quite a useful one for anthropology, and, a useful one for replacing the more solid field, with, of course, this caveat, which we were reminded of this morning, that these shifting sands actually is what anthropologists have always been negotiating to some extent. It's not something new. But I think it's quite a useful sort of idea for thinking about how we negotiate that. And certainly of the conference papers that I've heard, and inevitably in a conference like this, you always, you miss many of the papers. But I think there are a lot of papers that have alerted us to how people negotiate and try to transform these shifting sands, these two aspects. So we've had these sort of new articulations of belonging in context of displacement, new or different resurgences of religiosity, articulations of hope, social movements, whether they're coming from Buenos Aires or from New Cross, articulations of hope and of fear. So we've got these kind of, and I think ethnography remains an incredibly powerful means of being attentive to what's happening in those shifts, what sort of voices are emerging, what sort of representations are circulating and how. And this may be collaboratively or in a kind of more documentary kind of role. But I think we can also think, and this again came up to some extent this morning, about shifting sands in terms of the kind of disciplinary environment or structures that enable or prohibit our anthropological production. And I was struck by something Adam said this morning about, diversity of anthropologies, that London produces this diversity of anthropologies. And of course, diversity in many ways, or attentiveness to human diversity, is very much what anthropology has always been about. But there's also this kind of danger at the moment of a very simplistic kind of understandings of what diversity is in terms of public funding, or how kind of impact points are kind of generated or whatever. So I think the kind of diversity that anthropology is good at bringing out in its current form is not this diversity which is happily kind of saying, oh well, this person's got dark skin, or this person's of a different religion to that person, and therefore they are diverse, and therefore what they say, fits the bill of what we need to hear. But rather an attentiveness to the unexpected, and I think that again is what ethnography is really good at bringing out, a kind of tales of the unexpected, so that. A lot of the articulations that are coming out of the ethnographically grounded papers, the ones that I've heard, are ones that actually do not easily fit into these kind of expected narratives of what diversity is in sort of public understandings of it. So, we've got Cambodian protesters protesting against mining, those of you who are in this room just before, using or performing Avatar, a Hollywood film, in order to get their message across very effectively in terms of environmental activism. Or we've got one of the papers I heard this morning, organ donation in Kerala. Now, normally when we hear about organ donation, it's, we're supposed to go along with some sort of narrative of outrage, victimhood, the ripping of organs out of the poor by the rich, and so forth. But what we heard from this much more ethnographically grounded account was, a Christian priest going around promoting a kind of organ donation activism, in some senses, a kind of altruistic act. And we heard about a village in Kerala in South India which proudly boasts of being the organ donor literate village and is in the Limca Book of Records for being so. So it's a very different a kind of narrative that's surfacing from this kind of ethnographic engagement. And so I suppose I wanted then to sort of link it then to how we manage to enable this diversity. And on the one hand, we're in a context where, at some level, we've got more and more access to more and more means of communication, as have the people that we're working with, so that the possibilities of communication seem to be so huge. And at the same time, just because those possibilities are greater doesn't necessarily mean that, certain types of voices can get through, because certain types of narratives, certain types of images are much more catchy than others. Avatar works when you're trying to get attention from American environmental activists, perhaps better than something else. So I am interested really in how we as anthropologists can build a kind of publicly meaningful anthropology, which is perhaps different from what's expected of us in terms of, the narratives of funders, the narrative of public engagement that's perhaps encouraged by our universities, and also the narratives of impact, because I think very often in fitting into those narratives, we actually suppress precisely the kind of diversity of experiences and voices that we are trying to enable to surface. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great line to end on, and maybe one that I'll pick up on. So first, thank you. I'm fairly new to the UK and to London and to anthropology in London, and so this is a really nice event to get to know folks from other institutions and to get to know students who are working on all sorts of tremendous projects. I've had a day filled with lovely interactions with really stimulating intellectual work. So I dutifully wrote notes about every single paper that I heard, and then started to think about global shifts. I thought about ways that I could maybe, give a gloss on the concept. And then, as I was walking into this room, I had a little chat with a colleague of mine, and I was like, you know what? I think I'm just gonna scrap all that and try to do something a little bit different. Maybe be a little shifty, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe be a little shifty. So I'm going to read a quote to you, and this quote is from a talk Peter van der Veer gave not so long ago. And it was a talk that I remembered as I was listening to one of the papers in the afternoon session. So, quote, "If at the end of the 20th century, one were inventing a method of inquiry by which to grasp the complexity of social life, one might wish to invent something like the social anthropologist's ethnographic practice." And this is a quote from Marilyn Strathern, used by Peter van der Veer in a talk, I think a couple of years ago in the US. So I'll read it again, right? "If at the end of the 20th century, one were to invent a method of inquiry by which to grasp the complexity of social life, one might wish to invent something like the social anthropologist's ethnographic practice." So this quote kind of came to me because as I was hearing some of these very rich papers, it struck me that the reason why I was attracted to anthropology in the first place, and the reason why I consider myself an anthropologist, is because our method allows us to engage, right, with complexity at its starting point, at its root, in the social, in the relational. And so to me, this moment of engagement, this prolonged moment of engagement, some of you have been doing fieldwork for a short period of time in this room, some of you have been doing fieldwork for 20 years in the same place. These instances or moments over time are the space that sustain us and allow us to think about the world at large, right? To think about modernity at large, if I were to evoke, I think an important, right, progenitor to this conversation around the global, Arjuna Padarai. And it's this space where the grist for what we can kind of think with comes or emerges from. And so, in several papers today, the grist was rich, right? The kinds of materials that people were talking about were incredibly provocative. There was a gloss of alien in Sedona, Arizona, thinking about undocumented workers in relationship to utopic understandings of alien life forms, right? There was a paper in the same session that was thinking about a term, mayate, used in speech acts in New Mexico amongst people who were participating in a lowrider subcultural community. So lowriders are those cars that bounce up and down, right? As a term used to kind of mark racial difference, right, and specifically blackness. And so these kinds of openings, right, are what I think we need to start to think about, these complex world systems with And here's where I get to the caution point. And these are the points I wrote down, so let's see if I can freestyle them. So the two cautions that we were kind of given this morning, I think, were cautions that I was reflecting on as I went through the sessions today. The two cautions were, one, right, when thinking in the global, let's not take a topographical approach. The topographical approach, the approach that allows us to see from above, actually is in dissonance with our method, right? And obscures. And so when I think of that in relationship to ethnography, I think, okay, so we've learned sophisticated conceptual language, right? We go into the field with that sophisticated conceptual language that allows us to abstract or hover above. Perhaps if we can suspend that and listen, right, we can get to the same kind of complexity that the global evokes without resorting to that conceptual language. So that's one. Two, history. That history, so the global suggests, and this was the critique that followed suit, the kind of globalization conversations that were happening back in the 90s, right? When deterritorialization was all the rage. The idea that there's anything new, right, under the sun, is something that we should be cautious about. Moreover, I think we need to pay attention to the very specific histories within the context in which we work that produce the kind of openings that we are privileged to participate in. And I'll stop there because I'm interested in conversation. Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me to do this, and thank you both for thought-provoking me. And thank you all for those of you who gave papers today and organised things. It seems like a geological age ago that Katie and Rebecca introduced the day. And over the course of the day, I have also changed my mind a few times about what it was I was going to say. So I'm going to say that on the basis of today, I think anthropologists are climate change irresponsible. In order to get there, I'll tell a little story. I'm doing some research in India at the moment on roads, and this roads research has actually turned into something that's about nomads. Nomads cross this particular road in western Madhya Pradesh, not paying the toll. They have to dodge the trucks and things and cross the access barriers that prevent them crossing the road in the first place. However, the truck drivers on the road do pay a toll. They pay 120 rupees. What happens to that 120 rupees? Well, it's taken to a bank. Then it is transferred to the infra division of Z Entertainment, which is a satellite TV company who also happen to own this particular stretch of road in Madhya Pradesh. But it doesn't stop there. It goes through an offshore bank account in Mauritius, but it doesn't stop there either. It goes to another series of offshore bank accounts in the Isle of Man before it is churned around in the unregulated part of the London Stock Exchange. The unregulated part of the stock exchange is controlled by people called Nomads, who are nominated advisors who are the regulatory presence in the Wild West part of the London Stock Exchange. It's a very interesting world, and already quite far from the tarmac on this road in Madhya Pradesh. But from AIM, it's called the unregulated part of the stock exchange, the money then goes to the Cayman Islands through a group of lawyers and solicitors who are well known for having offices in a place called Panama. And there it disappears, or at least it disappears as far as I've been able to find out. And then another bunch of nomads turn up, the global elite, who own all of the fronts that allow this 120 rupees that we've paid in a toll to circulate around the world. They have a yacht called Clifford II, which is currently for sale in the south of France, And they migrate between the Cayman Islands and the south of France on an annual basis. It's yours for 16 million if you want it. And I think it's really fun to think of these three groups of nomads and this travelling 120 rupees passing from the toll booth in Madhya Pradesh onto the deck of the yacht. Maybe it was used for a canapé or something like that, Clifford II in the south of France. But the three lots of nomads do things at different speeds, have different access to different worlds. And yes, the circulation of money is about a global story, it's a global shift, but it's also a scale of friction and scale. And as you have said, ethnographic methods are not particularly well suited for doing all of that money following. So anthropology itself is not a particularly globalized set of methodologies, perhaps. I am 45, and in my lifetime, two big ideas seem to have characterized the world around me. The first of those has been globalization, and the second of those has been climate change. When I was a PhD student, globalization was just beginning to enter the world of anthropology. I was at the LSE, and there were two projects there funded by the ESRC called Globalization 1 and Globalization 2. They were more affectionately known as Glob 1 and Glob 2. And they were investigating questions that now, frankly, seem so naive that it's actually surprising looking back that they were funded. But at the time, they were at the forefront of what was being funded and of disciplinary activity. That's only 20 years ago that the idea of globalization was exciting enough to actually be funded. And I think giving a sort of recent genealogy to the idea of globalization is actually also very interesting, because apart from Glob 1 and Glob 2, not that long ago we were playing around with ideas like glocalization. Thank God that didn't catch on. And we phrases like prism of the local, some of which I see was echoed in today's program. And more recently it's been things like scale, friction, and a post-exotic world for some anthropologists. And I think that's all very interesting, but other disciplines have embraced the climate change agenda with an equal ferocity to the way in which we have embraced a globalization agenda. I think for anthropologists, globalization is now a starting point rather than a meaningful conclusion. I don't think there's really much debate about it. But climate change, on the other hand, methodologically and in terms of an investigative angle, has not really taken root. I think it's fair to say that climate change has been left out in the cold. And that's not only to do with air miles and the fact that we seem still to have to travel an awful long way in order to do this research. There are scientists in other parts of this university who don't travel to conferences unless they can go by train. This is a matter of disciplinary practice, standard. How many of us would think about doing that? The AAA, we couldn't miss that. Could we? The European Conference of this and that. I think as a discipline, climate change has not found its way into our consciousness, into our practice, or, based on today's experience, into our research agendas. So as my provocation for the day, I want to ask you why it should be. Is anthropology a carbon enemy?
Thank you.
Yes, I'm feeling really inspired by those three talks, and now I'm feeling really guilty, so thanks for that. Just come back from 2 very long haul flights. I really enjoyed today. Thank you for all the speakers I was lucky enough to attend. I haven't had anything pre-prepared as such as these wonderful talks, but what I have been talking about for a lot of the day today is a global shift, and for me the global shift is about the global shift in what I want is a global shift in anthropology. You know, this fantastic quote about the perfect discipline for the end of the 20th century, the start of the 21st, the richness of all the talks I've heard and all the talks I continue to hear in anthropology. Being someone that considers himself a bad anthropologist but still loves anthropology and loves the complexity and the nuance and the richness of what I hear on a day-to-day basis, it upsets me, it annoys me, and frustrates me that anthropology has not got a stronger voice in public life today. We had a post-Brexit talk here, which was fantastic, but where was anthropology during Brexit? Where was anthropology during elections? Why isn't there a stronger voice from anthropology within public life and more general? And maybe this is an issue with research agendas, with impact, with funding, with the ref. But one of my favourite artists, who's an incredible artist, I think probably the leading artist in the world today, Theaster Gaze. He has a fantastic quote where he talks about gaming the art world, using the art world for what he wants, acting as his tricks the character to enable himself to do huge, socially engaged projects through working in kind of the highest of the fine art world. So there's no reason, if this is the thing that's holding us back, if it's the ref, if it's impact, if it's outputs, if it's these structures that we're working in, that we have to use that as an excuse not to engage further. We can game the ref world like we can game the art world. And when I hear all these amazing papers, when I see all this fantastic work, that's what I want to happen. If that's the global shift that emerges out of today, then that's the shift that I really, in a proselytizing way, want to look for. That's my short and sweet message.
So, just a brief sort of summary. We've got this sort of attention to diversity, but diversity in a much more less, not based on just observable data as such, but sort of a much more deeper understanding of diversity, being shifty in this sort of attention to getting to the root of things and kind of what's possible, again, we've come to that idea of what's possible in 21st century anthropology. What isn't possible, perhaps, in 21st century anthropology through climate change or not travelling, and then this idea of sort of new forms of public engagement. These are just real snap points, but I would like not to talk. I would like to open the floor up. We only have about 20 minutes to really sort of interact with these points that have been brought forward. Other thoughts as well that you have from the various panels that you've attended to share and to bring to light here in this final discussion. So, yes, please.
Well, coincidentally, I was in a panel this afternoon which provoked a discussion about climate change from an ethnographic perspective by showing how the discourse of climate change can actually hide some very sort of real relations of production, social relations, which produce environmental damage. Did I understand that correctly? So I think that's a good example of how, again, to pick up from Emma, ethnography can question and challenge these sort of big ideas, which, although they may appear to be quite progressive, can actually have some kind of unintended consequences. And the reverse of that, I think, is globalization, because globalization has suddenly taken on a whole different lifespan as an explanation for Brexit, as an explanation for Trump's success. And that sort of collapsing of the very real processes, economic, social, political processes, that have created these shifts in terms of how people live or how difficult it is for some people to live. I think is precisely where we can, if we set our minds to it, and a lot of the young people in this room are doing that, to try to unpack what this globalization movement is trying to convey, and how dangerous it is to explain things through this kind of big idea of globalization. What is globalization really? How is it produced? Who reproduces it? Who is affected and how? And also from there, how can we respond to that? Probably in very different ways according to circumstances. That's all.
Did you want to respond?
Yes, please. I'm pleased to say I completely agree with you. I think that lots of the most interesting and nuanced work on climate change has been produced by anthropologists. Unfortunately, that's not been read quite as widely as Tony Giddens or Nick Stern, for example. But I think in terms of an ethnographic understanding of how the elephant in the room inhabits people's lives, it is anthropologists who've been really leading the way in thinking about the cultures of denial, the ways in which those sorts of discourses become parts of other forms of inequality. So I think there is potential for anthropology there. My point, if I had one was slightly different, that the political economy of the discipline and the organisation of methods and things like that has been utterly resilient to climate change.
Any further comments here?
I suppose one of the things that interested me in relation to what Raphael was saying was, as I didn't want to just talk about the breadth and the impact of this as constraining forces, but I think one of the things that I've sort of confronted in my own work, because I am quite interested in trying to write to wider audiences, is how quickly your work, mainstream media, if you can use that phrase or whatever, but once it gets into the Daily Mail, it becomes the absolute opposite of what you're actually doing. And that is a very frustrating process, because what journalists very often want, in my experience, when they interview you, is they've already decided their story. Their story is the story that everybody already wants to hear. There are victims, there are persecutors, there are rich, there are poor, and certain moral trajectories, and they use you to sort of hook a quote in. The author's published a book, and therefore that's a pretext for doing a piece on this at a particular time, and then it reproduces a certain type of very simplistic narrative, which is precisely what you're writing about. And I've had this experience via the Daily Mail, via the Sun, and then taken up in global media, so reproduced in a Pakistani newspaper, a Chinese newspaper, or whatever. And suddenly you find yourself caught up, or your name and the implication that your work is saying the precise opposite to what it's saying. So that is something that because it's very simplest. It's all very well to say public engagement, engage with the media, but actually it can actually be quite a complicated process in terms of what message actually gets across from all that.
I agree exactly. So I was on the BBC Breakfast News last week, which I was really excited about. Told my mum. It was all like a big situation in my life.
Yes.
And what had turned from like a very long conversation about complexity turned into saying exactly what I did not want them to edit me to say.
Yeah.
But that doesn't take me away from the same feeling of that we have to find new ways of presenting our work with all its complexity.
Yeah.
I think that's the really key point, is that we shouldn't be dumbing down our work or reducing it to some very simplistic idea, because the whole point is the richness of anthropology is the nuance and the complexity. So it's about finding new forms, in my opinion, of presentation that don't deny that complexity, whilst making our readership more than, I won't say how many people read my book because it's embarrassing. I get that they send me the royalty check. I want that to be furthered without being reduced. And I think we can develop ways of doing that. And I think this department is trying to do that, amongst other places, to really try and find ways of presenting complexity in a more accessible way.
Just to respond to that really quickly, so one of the things, so I finished my PhD not so long ago, 2015, so I'm fresh, right, and a junior scholar here. And I finished up in the US. And in the US, the push in the US Academy has been to kind of encourage doctoral students to not only write or think about writing in academic spaces, right, so in journals, or to write books, but to start to think about writing in non-conventional, non-mainstream press spaces. Now, I've done a little bit of that. All of my peers who finished with me, who are now in the US and in tenure track jobs, are doing that. And I think it's great. I mean, I think it is one avenue to kind of pursue and to engage with. I think that the worry I have for myself and for all of us, right, is the kind of labor that entails. So that we're producing ourselves in multiple spaces, and the onus is on us to therefore do all of this. And so, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a way out of that, but certainly, that's an option to start writing in these kinds of spaces.
Okay, Adam.
Yeah, just thinking on the themes of how diversity and public engagement intersect. I think Emma, you made some of what you were saying actually illustrates how they don't go together and the difficulties of, in a situation of diversity of certain voices coming forwards. But it's just really a comment on that. My observation in the panels that I went to was that the voice of the conference has shifted a bit over the last year or two, because I seem to remember a year or two ago going to a presentation after presentation where the presenter agonised about their own fieldwork. And how can I possibly talk on behalf of other people? How can I possibly do this? And what the problems were, and using the self, using the subjectivity as a resource, within ethnography. And the presentations that I went to said, I couldn't go to everything, of course, but were entirely unlike that. They're much more descriptive, much more sort of equally problematic in the sense of bringing to the fore kind of the problems within the fieldwork, very contested environments, but describing kind of other people's problems, and particularly with in the ones I went to, I had this sense of people investing in sort of accounting for other people's situation. I mean, there's good and there's bad. I think anthropologists commonly have this experience where you go to one field site and you identify with it and you become very like it, and then you go to another field site and it's very, very difficult because you've invested in the kind of cultural situation of the first one, and the second one is very tricky. And the presentations I went to, there was that. On the one hand, the good thing, in a sense, was engagement. But I saw a few people who were actually invested in a particular set of informants. But on the other hand, there were often other global contested voices, other countries, diasporas, institutions, which were treated then very critically, because the anthropologists themselves were invested. So it's really a comment that in a situation of diversity, combined with engagement, you get imbalance as well. And I thought that was sort of good and courageous and brave, but also potentially problematic.
There's a question: Can you do justice to multiple authorship around your field experiences?
Yeah. I saw sort of hierarchies developing in some people's work, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, I mean, so I just finished writing a piece on these sorts of issues within the context of making a collaborative film in Delhi with Somali refugees, right? So the film was about emergent kinds of forms of racial discrimination having to do with the African migrant population to the city. And so I made this film with Somalis. Somalis had a very particular positionality within the context, right? They were positioned differently than the Nigerians that I got to know, than the Ivorians that I got to know, than the Bihari migrants, right, who are coming in as laborers that I got to know. And so I mean, I don't even think we need to leave one field site to kind of encounter this complexity, right? But it can all be in one place. And so, the film project in and of itself tried to attempt to nuance a politics of difference, starting with this kind of very anti-black sentiment circulating in this community that I was working with, but then kind of deconstructing that into various kinds of registers of difference, right? But the medium of film only explicitly narrates so much. Then I felt compelled to write some things. I wrote an article, but even within the article, there was this struggle of of narration, of how to narrate this particular case. I mean, I think the answer to that question is to not shy away, right? The answer to that question is to actually embrace that as an analytical space that's worthwhile. That complexity often, I think, in the history of our discipline, has gotten kind of siloed, so that we only focus on one set of politics emerging in a particular context. I think keeping it open, keeping that space open, and recognizing the kind of complexity is a worthwhile endeavor, although quite a precarious one, right?
Well, I guess one of the things that's very complicated is that with certain types of collaborative work or a kind of partiality, a kind of self-conscious partiality, is then there's a lot of things that can't be said. There's another set of constraints as to what can be expressed. So it's not, I mean, I agree, it's not, it brings out certain productive directions, but it also closes off quite a lot. And I think it's quite important to recognize the partiality and to be able to analyze that as well. Otherwise, one just becomes a mouthpiece for other people, a conduit for, certain voices and so forth, which I don't think that's necessarily what we want to be. I don't think. So shifting perspectives, then this shifting business is also about being able to shift perspectives, I said, and not just home in on one and think this is the real thing, which, and obviously because we're engaging with people in relationships, which are often very compelling, and people's situations are often very compelling.
Have you found that possible to do as anthropologists, a shift?
In the last project I've done, which is about the global trade in human hair, that is exactly what I have tried to do, is I've taken hair, rather than, the person who sells the hair off it, I've taken hair as my central narrative, and I've allowed the hair to take me into different people's lives. And it might be the lives of people who are religiously offering their hair in a temple. It might be the lives of Orthodox Jewish women who are wearing hairs for their own purposes in North London. It might be going into African and Caribbean identity politics, heritage, debates about natural hair. It might be going into the politics of comics. So I've literally tried to do precisely that. I've tried to shift position. But then I also had a grant that enabled me to do that. Not in terms of money, but in terms of time. So I was able, I think, to do what I would say a kind of multi-perspective kind of product. And what I tried to do then was to try to publish that as a non-anthropological non-fiction with a mainstream publisher rather than with an academic publisher. But this is where I was reasonably content with what I managed to do in terms of being able to bring in those different perspectives. But not so content when I see the Daily Mail, because that's the other consequence then of publishing in a different milieu, is that it gets taken up in a different milieu. So it's, wonderful when it's all reviewed in the sort of literary novelist kind of milieu. But then this other milieu where you then feel really responsible at somehow contributing to a whole lot of stereotypes which you're actually writing against, but you're being used as if you're contributing to it, and I do think that's quite tricky. So how to control, and I think also we are so self-conscious as anthropologists of how we use language, of the representational responsibilities that we carry. And so I personally found it incredibly difficult suddenly losing control of that voice and finding it being used in different ways. But
Chris?
Yeah, I thought I had a question primarily for Ed, but I think Emma kind of just answered part of it. But Ed, I found your account very beguiling, and it also seemed a kind of interesting, if inadvertent riposte to this return belated discovery of ethnography, and that it seemed to suggest the limitations of localized study. I assume that the moral of the story was that ethnography is very good at allowing us to understand the first set of nomads, but not so good at helping us understand the second two. And maybe Emma's comments just then sort of provided a solution to some of those questions. But I'd like to hear more about how you envisage a post-conventional ethnographic anthropology that's able to do connected global ethnography sketch in the bigger picture, which is clearly what we need to be doing.
Without travelling.
Yeah.
It's that contradiction between the talk we've had all day about global and the global shift and carbon politics that I really wanted to sort of push into the audience in my comments. I think that if I can also just go back to something that was said earlier, I don't actually share the anxiety about wanting recognition or wanting engagement with the world in the same way that many of my colleagues do, and it's something I hear over and over and over and over again, and I wonder where that comes from, whether it's a sort of strange confluence of impact, ref, 2021 and Facebook, like wanting to be liked through impact or something like that. I can't really think where it comes from.
I've never been on Facebook. So I don't think it's about wanting to be liked. I think it's about wanting to complicate the
absolutely. But
representations.
if I could finish, if I look around the room, your work is incredibly widely read outside academia. There are other people in the room who are incredibly well cited, have been awarded for this and that. I think anthropologists are sort of out there and they are doing it. They're in TED and on Conversation and in the Guardian long read. And we can't all do that because someone has to teach. Someone has to sit on committees. So it almost seems as if you have to have an agreement that someone in the department becomes that person, someone else does the teaching and someone else does the research, or otherwise we're all going to be grey very, very quickly, running around trying to fulfill all these unfulfillable sorts of demands on our time and on our skill set. Because I think that doing that sort of public engagement is quite a different sort of activity to anything that any department I'm really aware of trains PhD students to do. It's just a different sort of activity. But Chris, your fantastic question. I mean, my model at the moment for thinking about this was Didier Fassin writing about the police in France, where he managed to turn ethnographic encounters on the streets of Paris into a national debate. And I think that really worked brilliantly in the way that he managed to make his ethnography speak to not only those people, not to interested what would you call them, stakeholders, but actually to everyone in France for whom those debates became important. And I think in that work he really managed to make his ethnography work for him because he turned it into something that France could own, debate and contest. And I think that is one way of pushing it up the scale. But at the same time, having said that, I don't think I would be welcome on the Clifford 2 to have the canopé that the toll had funded. So there are questions of access to these things. There are questions of movement. As I've said, the recalcitrance of the political economy of methodology to a climate change agenda. And I also think that there's a surprising silence over how research has changed, even in the last 2 decades. Doing research now is not the same as it was when you and I were PhD students because of the internet, which makes it a world a very, very different sort of place. So I can't find out who owns the Clifford 2 because of all sorts of international secrecy laws, but I have been able to find out who the chief stewardess was because she put it on her CV and posted on LinkedIn. So I can actually do it.
Lizzie, yeah?
Thinking about global shifts, it strikes me that, you know, when you read the kind of popular, widely read theories of this century, you know, Piketty, or more recently, like books like Mason's Post-Capitalism, a lot of these kind of popular texts about capitalism and, you know, post-crash economics describe capitalism as a kind of in imminent crisis, and, you know, it's all about to come tumbling down, and, you know, we're facing this kind of imminent shift. Whereas when you read most anthropology, capitalism appears to be really quite entrenched and continues to be quite firmly, you know, sustained in a sense. So there's this kind of temporal disjuncture, I think, and dissonance. And so to what extent should we be engaging with these kind of major theories and popular ideas, or is that inimical to, you know, the anthropological method? And you know, how do we grapple with these very different kind of temporal imaginaries that are both within our discipline and beyond it?
I mean, I think it's an issue of scale. I believe you mentioned scale at the beginning of this day, right? So we're working on multiple scales. We're taking in all sorts of different discourses, from the kind of popular academic to the obscure academic, right, to the popular, to whatever. And then we're going to a place where there's a set of circulations happening within that place with the people that we're working with. My feeling is that the ethnographic is about all of those things as they come into play within particular interactions, right? So if it's emerging within a context, then it needs to be talked about and it needs to be written about. So, you know, when I write, I'm pretty synthetic in the kinds of materials that I bring together. So it's not, you know, some sort of purification ritual that it's about ethnography qua my time in a particular place with particular people, but it's about ethnography as a site for recognizing certain kinds of movements and circulations where I'm also embedded or part and parcel of this process, right? My imagination counts too, my sociological, my anthropological, all sorts of imaginations count. So if Piketty comes up, right, then Piketty gets talked about. And then I think there was a comment about multiple like ways of kind of imagining ethnography outside. At least that's what I heard, right? Ways of imagining ethnography outside of the kind of Strathernian quote that I started with, this kind of belated quote, I think as you put it. I mean, you know, what we do or how we follow, to kind of use the Clifford kind of maxim, right? How we follow our ethnographies, I think, are idiosyncratic, and they necessarily should be, right? So by that I mean, like, what starts in one place. So I think you might have thought through all of these multi-sites, right? Perhaps some of them at least, and then some of them kind of got produced in the field, so you went somewhere and somebody pointed you in a direction and they just emerged. I mean, I think that sort of openness is part and parcel of what, you know, what I imagine when I think of ethnography as a flexible way of knowing. So, yeah. So I mean, I don't think it's about this kind of conception of going someplace and then coming back from that someplace, right? I think that there's something else we need to be thinking about, and it needs to be a much more flexible form, which includes social media, which includes looking up, what was it, LinkedIn, right? And as a site, as a site for analysis.
So one final comment in the corner.
Yeah, just a short question. I just wanted to ask about the question of climate change. That, to what extent, in understanding anthropology's aversion, if I understood correctly what you present to the idea, one would have to more consider a conceptual question of cultural relativism and how climate change is often seen as a sort of global, autonomously operating, universal phenomenon, which really goes against a lot of tenets that have really settled for the past decades in anthropology, rather than a question of method being a question of really a kind of paradigm in the last decades in anthropology.
I think that the reason the aversion is perhaps located slightly elsewhere. I think that there's the sort of compulsion in anthropology to travel, to think of itself as a global discipline that espouses a particular form of disciplinary politics quite often, which is very important. But whereas other disciplines have actually embraced climate change as a challenge to their own practices, anthropologists have not. That's not to say that climate change has not become an interesting research question for some people, but that the structure of the discipline, the way we think about methodology and theory is not particularly reoriented by those debates.
It's 6:05, so I'm conscious that there's drinks and a different space to engage.